In a London prison, prisoners stopped complaining about rats and chains. They complained about warmth. In the dead of winter, stone walls sweated like skin, pulsing gently at night, pressing heat into their bodies while they slept. Every execution nearby made the prison warmer, calmer, almost satisfied. Years later, workers cut into the walls and found pale, greasy veins running through the stone, softening when touched by fire and smelling horribly familiar. The prison had been fed. Human fat mixed into mortar so the building would never die. The men are gone. The keeper is forgotten. But the walls are still warm, still standing, still breathing beneath the city. The first complaint was not hunger, not chains, not the stink of the Fleet River creeping through the lower stones. It was warmth. In the depth of a London winter, when frost filmed the Thames and breath cracked the air, men woke sweating in their irons, palms slick against stone that should have been numbingly cold. The heat did not blaze or comfort. It lingered, dull and intimate, pressed close to the skin like a body that refused to move away. Straw mattresses grew damp beneath them, not from leaks or breath alone, but from a slow perspiration seeping out of the walls themselves. At night the prison changed its posture. Fleet had always been heavy, a mass of stone crouched beside the river, but after sunset it seemed to settle inward, drawing its weight closer. The walls swelled and relaxed in cycles too slow to track, releasing warmth in soft pulses that rolled through the cells. Prisoners lay awake counting them without knowing why, their own breathing gradually falling into the same measured rhythm. When sleep came, it was shallow and thick with dreams of being pressed into narrow spaces, of stone closing gently but without mercy. By morning the illusion weakened but never vanished. The corridors remained warm to the touch, even where sunlight never reached. Moisture clung to the masonry, tracing slow paths downward like sweat along a spine. The air carried a faint, sweet heaviness beneath the usual rot and sewage, a smell that settled in the back of the throat and refused to leave. Men who pressed their foreheads to the wall felt a lingering heat seep into bone, followed by a subtle vibration, as though something deeper than stone shifted behind the surface. Guards noticed the warmth and dismissed it as dampness from the river, yet they lingered less in certain corridors, moving more quickly where the stone felt thickest. Torches burned lower there, their flames wavering without draft. Sound behaved strangely, footsteps softened, voices flattened, swallowed before they could travel far. The prison seemed eager to keep what entered it, whether heat, sound, or flesh. Fleet was filled with debtors, men who had not been sentenced to die but had been allowed to decay. Their days were measured in coin owed and favors begged, their bodies thinning as weeks stretched into months. Yet as they weakened, the prison did not. The stone appeared smoother where hands brushed it daily. Mortar lines darkened and tightened, resisting chips and cracks. In a city where buildings sagged and split under winter frost, Fleet endured with unsettling ease. On certain days, the warmth grew stronger. These were the days when bells tolled beyond the walls, when the condemned were led through nearby streets toward the gallows. From high, barred windows, prisoners watched the procession move like a slow wound through the crowd. As the rope did its work and the body stilled, a change passed through the prison. The heat deepened, spreading through corridors and cells alike, as if the building itself had been fed. No one spoke of it openly. Men learned quickly which sensations invited mockery and which invited silence. Yet in the hours before dawn, when the city lay hushed and even the river seemed to pause, the truth pressed in on them. The prison was not merely holding them. It was responding. And in that steady, breathing warmth, something ancient and patient had begun to wake. By daylight the illusion weakened but never vanished. The masonry held a dull, animal warmth that lingered against bare skin and soaked into rags. Condensation traced slow paths down the blocks like perspiration, gathering at the base of walls where straw darkened and rotted faster than it should have. Hands that rested too long against the stone tingled afterward, as though blood had been drawn outward and then returned reluctantly. The heat did not radiate evenly. It pooled. Corners were warmer than open stretches, thresholds warmer than door leaves, the places where weight met resistance carrying a thickness that pressed back. Guards noticed it too, though they named it dampness and moved on. They shifted their cloaks in the corridors and wiped their palms on their belts, frowning without comment. Keys felt oddly warm when lifted from hooks. Iron bars sweated faintly in the early hours, slick to the touch, and the smell of metal carried a richness beneath the rust. Men assigned to the lower levels shortened their rounds, inventing reasons to linger in the yard where cold air cut cleanly through wool and bone. None of them said why. In Fleet, naming a thing gave it shape, and shape invited blame. The prisoners learned to fear the hours before dawn most of all. Those hours stretched differently, thickened by exhaustion and a silence that pressed inward from every side. The city beyond the walls quieted to a distant murmur, carts and cries reduced to memory. Even the river seemed to withdraw, its constant wet breath fading until only the prison remained. In that stillness, the building asserted itself, not with sound, but with pressure. A heaviness settled in the chest, subtle at first, then insistent, as if the air itself resisted movement. Men woke without knowing why, their eyes snapping open to darkness dense enough to feel textured. Breathing slowed. The warmth deepened, not rising but spreading, seeping from stone into flesh. It carried a faint vibration that traveled through bone more than ear, a grinding patience that suggested work being done somewhere out of sight. Some pressed their palms flat against the wall and felt it answer, not with movement, but with a steady, yielding firmness, like leaning into a body that leaned back. Sleep became treacherous. Dreams bled into waking, filled with narrow corridors that curved when followed and cells that shrank by imperceptible degrees. Men dreamed of being measured, of weight being taken and redistributed, of their own outlines impressed into stone. Those who cried out woke hoarse, their throats raw as if they had been breathing dust. Others woke calm and emptied, their fear dulled to a vague resignation that frightened them more than panic ever had. As weeks passed, patterns emerged. New arrivals complained first, recoiling from walls with curses and disbelief. Old prisoners watched them quietly, knowing the protests would fade. Complaints turned into avoidance. Certain cells were left empty when possible, their doors left ajar despite the cold drafts that slipped through. In those cells the warmth was strongest, the air thickest, the stone carrying a sheen that caught torchlight and bent it softly. Rats avoided them. Insects too. Even mold crept reluctantly, growing pale and brittle before vanishing altogether. The keeper of the prison walked these corridors daily. He moved with the ease of a man who knew every inch of the place by feel alone, his boots striking stone with measured certainty. He paused often, resting a hand against the walls as though checking their pulse. When repairs were ordered, he oversaw them personally, insisting on mixtures that made masons uneasy. Lime and sand were blended longer than necessary, water added in careful stages. The resulting mortar spread thick and smooth, setting slowly, retaining warmth long after it should have cooled. When questioned, the keeper merely nodded, as if patience were the only answer required. The smell during these repairs lingered. It was not the sharp bite of fresh lime nor the sourness of river water. It carried a richness that clung to the back of the throat and followed men into the yard. Those who worked closest complained of headaches and an unaccountable hunger that arrived even after full meals. One mason refused to return, claiming the walls hummed when he leaned too close, a low sound felt behind the eyes. He was mocked and dismissed, yet his replacement worked with sleeves rolled down and eyes averted. On days of execution, the prison changed. The warmth rose earlier, spreading through corridors before dawn. Prisoners sensed it before the bells rang, a restless tightening that made sleep impossible. From narrow windows they watched crowds gather in the distance, the scaffold rising like a dark thought against the pale sky. When the drop fell and the body stilled, a slow release followed. The heat deepened, rolling through Fleet in a wave that left men breathless. Some wept without understanding why. Others felt a momentary relief, as if a pressure had been satisfied. Afterward, the building settled. The warmth remained, but its edge softened, content for a time. The keeper ordered repairs soon after. Small sections of wall opened and closed again with fresh mortar. No rubble accumulated. Nothing went to waste. The prison grew smoother, its joints tightening, its surfaces darkening to a soft, waxed glow that resisted grime. In a city where winter split stone and warped wood, Fleet endured untouched. Men who had entered healthy began to fail in quiet ways. Their strength ebbed faster than hunger alone could explain. Skin grew sallow, eyes dulled. Some complained of a constant heaviness in the chest, others of limbs that felt hollowed, as though something essential had been drawn out through the skin. Physicians blamed foul air and despair. Priests spoke of moral rot. Neither explanation satisfied those who felt the walls close in when the lights went low. The building did not feel cruel. That was the most unsettling truth. It felt indifferent, methodical, attentive only to its own needs. It held heat because it kept what it was given. It pressed inward because pressure made things stronger. In the hours before dawn, when the last sounds of the city dissolved and the prison breathed steadily around them, men understood this without words. Fleet was not merely containing them. It was learning from them. Fleet Prison had always been a place of waiting rather than punishment, a warehouse for debt and misfortune where time itself was the chief instrument of harm. Men entered owing coin and left owing years, their names fading from memory long before their bodies failed. Inside its walls, days stacked without distinction, measured not by progress, but by erosion. Hair thinned, backs bent, voices softened. Yet as the men diminished, the prison did not. Stone thickened with use, corridors smoothed by passing hands, and the buildings seemed to draw substance from the very act of confinement. The debtors learned the geography of delay intimately. Upper chambers held those with coin enough to buy space and air, while the lower wards pressed men closer to the river and its sour breath. Below the waterline, cells sweated constantly, their floors slick, their walls warm enough to raise blisters on bare skin in winter. These men were not condemned by law, only by arithmetic, and arithmetic had no mercy. Each day unpaid deepened the sentence. Each night the walls pressed closer, patient and unyielding. Executions took place not far away, staged as public reassurance that order still functioned beyond Fleet's gates. The scaffold rose and fell with practiced efficiency, rope measured, not set, drop calculated to break rather than strangle when fortune favored the condemned. The crowds gathered early, hungry for certainty in a city that offered little else. From the upper windows of Fleet, prisoners watched the procession form, watched the condemned walk past under guard, their faces already withdrawn from the world they were leaving. Those days carried a different weight inside the prison. Long before the bells rang, the warmth began to build. It crept upward from the lower stones and spread through corridors, softening the air and thickening breath. Men felt it in their joints, a subtle loosening followed by a deep fatigue. The building seemed to brace itself, as if anticipating an arrival. When the final act was done and the crowd's noise dissolved into the city, a release followed. The heat rolled outward, slow and enveloping, leaving behind a sense of completion that unsettled even those too distant to understand its source. The condemned rarely knew the prison watched them pass. Their final thoughts belonged elsewhere, fixed on rope and sky and the moment between. Yet their bodies did not vanish entirely from Fleet's story. After the crowd dispersed and the scaffold was cleared, carts moved quietly through side streets. What could not be sold or buried cheaply was rendered down elsewhere, out of sight, out of mind. Fat was separated, clarified, stored. In a city where nothing of value was wasted, even death was processed with efficiency. Within Fleet, the keeper maintained meticulous records, not of men, but of stone, cracks noted and sealed, joints reinforced, surfaces treated and smoothed. Repairs followed executions with ritual regularity. Sections of wall were opened briefly and closed again, the new mortar darker, richer, slower to set. Masons worked under close supervision, their questions met with silence or dismissal. They left at the end of the day uneasy and tired, their clothes carrying a smell that soap failed to remove. The prisoners noticed the changes before anyone else. Walls that had once been rough grew slick, almost waxed. Chips and flakes vanished. Corners rounded imperceptibly, losing the sharpness that caught skin and cloth. The warmth no longer fluctuated as wildly after executions. It settled into a steady presence, contained, as though the building had learned how to hold what it received. Men who leaned too long against the stone felt drained afterward. Their strength leached away in small, cumulative measures. Illness spread unevenly. Some wards emptied quickly, bodies failing without visible cause, while others lingered, their occupants reduced to husks yet stubbornly alive. Physicians blamed the river, the air, the moral weakness of debtors. None could explain why certain cells produced rapid decline, while others merely prolonged suffering. The answer lay in the walls themselves, though no one yet dared name it. The keeper walked the prison with increasing satisfaction. His hand lingered longer against treated stone. He listened more closely in the early hours, when the building was quiet enough to be felt rather than heard. What he sensed confirmed his belief. Stone, like flesh, responded to nourishment. Given the right substance, it strengthened, endured, adapted. The prison no longer aged as other buildings did. Frost failed to split it. Damp failed to rot it. Where neighboring structures sagged and cracked, Fleet remained composed, self-contained, resilient. Men died inside its walls and were forgotten. New men replaced them, thinner, poorer, carrying the same futile hope that time might reverse itself. The prison accepted them all without distinction. It did not rage or punish. It waited. Each life that passed through left a trace, a residue absorbed into the fabric of the place. Heat was the most obvious sign, but not the only one. Sound softened. Light dulled. Even smell altered, the sharpness of rot giving way to a heavier, sweeter undertone that clung to stone and skin alike. Those who survived long enough came to understand the prison's true nature without ever articulating it. Fleet was not merely a container for human failure. It was a process. Men entered incomplete, burdened by debt and desperation, and left diminished, stripped down to what could be taken. Coin first, then strength, then time. What remained was absorbed quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. On days without executions, the prison felt restless. The warmth fluctuated, corridors tightening and loosening as though awaiting something overdue. The keeper ordered smaller repairs on such days, feeding the walls in lesser measures. It was never enough to satisfy them entirely, but it kept the balance. The building had learned expectation. It knew when nourishment should arrive. From the outside, Fleet appeared unchanged, a grim but ordinary fixture of the city as punishment. Inside, it grew denser, stronger, more complete. The men within it withered, unaware that their waiting served a purpose beyond their own suffering. As long as debtors entered and bodies passed nearby to the rope, the prison would endure. It had found its rhythm. It had learned what the city could give, and it waited patiently for the next offering. As seasons turned, the prison aged backward. Winters passed without leaving their usual scars. Frost traced the city beyond Fleet, splitting brick and buckling wood. Yet the prison's stone did not flake or fracture. Where nearby buildings shed mortar like scabbed skin, Fleet grew smoother, its joints tightening as if drawn together by an inward pull. The walls darkened to a soft, waxy sheen that resisted soot and grime, catching lantern light and bending it gently rather than scattering it. The structure did not simply endure the weather. It seemed to digest it. Repairs became unnecessary in ways that unsettled those tasked with maintaining the place. Hairline cracks observed one week, closed by the next without intervention. Damp patches retreated, leaving stone firm and warm beneath the palm. Wooden fittings warped elsewhere in the city, but within Fleet they remained strangely stable, as though the air itself cushioned them against change. When work was ordered out of habit rather than need, the labor proved difficult. Tools dulled against stone that resisted chisel and hammer alike. Blades skidded where they should have bitten. Mallets rang with a deadened tone that traveled poorly, swallowed by walls that refused to answer. The keeper took pride in this resistance. He spoke little of it, but his satisfaction showed in the care with which he oversaw every minor alteration. Lime and sand were ordered in odd proportions, measured with an exactness that bordered on ritual. Water was added slowly, stirred longer than any mason considered sensible. The resulting mixture offended instinct. It spread too smoothly, clung too willingly, and set with an unsettling patience, remaining warm to the touch long after it should have cooled. When finally hardened, it did not crumble under pressure but yielded slightly, then returned to stillness, as though it remembered its shape. The smell during these works was wrong. It was not the sharp burn of lime, nor the wet tang of river water. It carried a richness that pressed into the sinuses and lingered long after the last bucket was emptied. Men complained of it following them home, clinging to hair and clothes, seeping into bedding. Soap dulled it, but did not erase it. Those who worked closest felt an unaccountable fatigue settle into their limbs, a heaviness that sleep did little to lift. They returned the next day quieter, eyes averted, sleeves pulled down to avoid brushing bare skin against the stone. Within the prison, the changes were unmistakable. Corridors grew more uniform, their angles subtly corrected, their lines drawn inward. Doorways narrowed by fractions too small to measure, yet large enough to feel when shoulders brushed stone. Stairwells tightened as they descended, pressing breath from the chest without altering a single visible dimension. Sounds softened further, footsteps absorbed into the floor, voices flattened before they could carry. Even screams failed to travel far, dying close to their source as though the walls refused to pass them along. The warmth stabilized. It no longer surged and retreated with the same urgency, settling instead into a constant, deep presence. In winter it was unmistakable, rising through boots and bedding alike. In summer it hid beneath the surface, detectable only by those who lingered too long in one place. The air thickened slightly, pressing against the lungs, encouraging slower movement, shallower breaths. Men adapted without knowing why, conserving energy, speaking less, yielding to the pace imposed upon them. The keeper began to limit access to certain sections of the prison. Some corridors were locked without explanation, their doors sealed with fresh mortar that set darker than the surrounding stone. Guards were reassigned, their patrols shortened. Those who questioned the changes were reminded of their position. Fleet was old, they were told. It had its ways. Better not to disturb what held together so well. Outside, the city changed. Fires swept through nearby districts, leaving blackened shells where homes had stood. Floods crept up from the river, undermining foundations and warping walls. Yet Fleet emerged from each disaster untouched. Smoke stained its outer face, but failed to penetrate. Water lapped at its base and receded without loosening a single stone. The prison stood as it always had, heavy and composed, an island of permanence amid ruin. Rumors followed. Some claimed the prison had been built on sacred ground, others that its stones were quarried from places best left alone. Clerks whispered of unusual expenditures, of materials purchased and accounted for without clear purpose. No accusation found purchase. Fleet was, after all, a place where men vanished quietly. Its reputation discouraged curiosity. Inside, prisoners continued to fail. Their decline grew more uniform, less dramatic. Death came softly, often in sleep. Bodies discovered warm hours later, the stone beneath them warmer still. Rats gnawed elsewhere, but avoided the cells where the walls shone darkest. Insects died quickly, their shells brittle and pale. The prison did not tolerate competition. The keeper aged differently than those around him. While guards grew stooped and gray, he retained a solidity that defied his years. His movements remained measured, his posture upright. He spent long hours alone in the corridors, listening. Sometimes he knelt at the base of newly sealed walls, pressing his palm flat against the stone and holding it there until the warmth equalized. What he felt confirmed his belief. The prison was no longer merely constructed. It was consolidated, its elements bound into something cohesive and enduring. Those who glimpsed the process without understanding it felt a wordless unease. Fleet no longer behaved like a building subject to time and neglect. It behaved like a body that had found equilibrium. Repairs were not acts of preservation, but of feeding, small adjustments that kept the whole satisfied. The smell that lingered after each intervention was the scent of completion rather than decay. By the end of that cycle of seasons, it became clear that the prison did not require the city's care any longer. It drew what it needed from those within and from the quiet commerce of death beyond its walls. Stone thickened. Heat held. The joints tightened further, sealing the structure against intrusion and loss. Fleet had learned how to remain. And in learning that lesson, it had begun to outlast the hands that built it and the bodies that filled it, settling into a permanence that felt less like survival and more like intention. The truth surfaced not through confession but through accident, dragged into the open by routine rather than courage. A minor renovation had been ordered along one of the inner corridors, not because the wall had failed, but because custom demanded periodic inspection. A hairline discoloration had appeared near the floor, faint and easily dismissed, yet the keeper allowed the work to proceed. It was an indulgence, a gesture of confidence rather than concern, and it would prove to be his first miscalculation. When the outer stone was removed, the expected rubble did not appear. Instead, the exposed interior revealed layers of hardened mortar unlike anything the masons had seen. It was dense and smooth, compacted to a uniformity that resisted the blade. Running through it were pale, greasy veins, thin as threads in some places, and thickening elsewhere into soft seams that caught the light. The surface glistened faintly, not with moisture, but with a dull, wax sheen that seemed to shift when viewed too long. Torchlight brought the first wave of understanding. As heat touched the exposed section, the mortar softened slightly, yielding under pressure before settling back into place. A smell rose immediately, heavy and intimate, striking the back of the throat with brutal familiarity. It was the scent of kitchens and tallow shops, of candles and grease fires, but fouled by something sweeter and more rotten beneath. More than one man retched. Another dropped his torch, the flames sputtering as if reluctant to burn near the open wall. No explanation was offered at first. The keeper arrived quickly, his expression unreadable, and ordered the section sealed at once. Fresh mortar was mixed and applied with unusual haste, pressed into place before questions could form fully. The smell lingered despite this, seeping into the corridor and clinging to skin and cloth. Men left early that day, their appetite gone, their thoughts unsettled in ways they could not articulate. Rumor traveled faster than stone could be closed. Word spread among the workers, pieced together from memory and instinct. The scent had been too precise to dismiss. Rendered fat carried that signature, clarified and strained, stripped of its obvious corruption, yet forever marked by its source. In a city where bodies were processed daily, the knowledge came easily once the first barrier fell. What had been sealed inside Fleet's walls was not refuse. It was resource. Records were revisited quietly, pages turned with hands that shook despite themselves. Executions were logged with care, each body accounted for in terms of law and spectacle. What followed afterward was less rigorously documented. Disposal contracts changed hands often, costs negotiated down in the name of efficiency. Fat, after all, was valuable. It burned cleanly. It preserved. It bound. In the hands of someone patient and precise, it could be transformed into something durable. The keeper's methods, once re-examined, took on a new clarity. The odd proportions of lime and sand. The insistence on slow mixing. The warmth retained by fresh mortar long after it should have cooled. Fat altered stone the way it altered flesh, lending flexibility where brittleness would otherwise form, sealing pores, resisting intrusion. Bound into the walls, it fed the prison's unnatural endurance. Layer by layer, life reduced to function. Those who had worked on repairs remembered now the way the mixture clung to their tools, the way it stained skin faintly yellowed, the way it resisted washing. They remembered the hunger that followed a day's labor, sharp and unrelenting, as though their bodies recognized something familiar and responded in kind. What had once seemed a private discomfort became evidence. The walls had not merely been warm. They had been nourished. Confrontation never came. There was no dramatic reckoning, no public accusation. The keeper did not deny what had been uncovered, but neither did he explain it. His silence carried a quiet certainty that unsettled more than any defense could have. He had believed stone, like flesh, required nourishment, and he had acted accordingly. The city provided what it could not use. Debt provided bodies. The gallows provided material. Nothing, in his mind, had been wasted. The prison responded as he believed it would. Each addition strengthened it further, sealing cracks before they could form, resisting weather and time with a stubborn patience that bordered on will. The warmth was not a byproduct. It was a sign of retention, of energy held and redistributed. The walls breathed because they were fed, expanding and settling as any living structure might under sustained care. Attempts to halt the process came quietly and failed just as quietly. Orders were issued to limit renovations, to restrict access, to audit materials more closely. Yet the prison required less intervention with each passing year. Where work was forbidden, none was needed. The walls held. The joints tightened. The building maintained itself with unnerving efficiency. What had already been given could not be extracted without risking collapse, and no official wished to be responsible for such a failure. Those who knew the truth carried it poorly. Sleep became difficult. The warmth no longer felt merely oppressive but accusatory, a constant reminder of what lay pressed into the stone. Some avoided the corridors where the discovery had been made, detouring through longer routes despite the press of guards and time. Others found themselves drawn there against their will, compelled to press a hand against the sealed section and feel the steady heat beneath, as though the wall remembered the moment it had been exposed. The keeper remained. Age touched him lightly, leaving his body solid even as his hair thinned. He walked the prison with the same measured pace, his satisfaction undiminished. The work was nearly complete. The prison no longer required frequent feeding. It had stored enough to sustain itself for generations. Each layer of mortar represented a conversion, flesh to structure, debt to permanence. The discovery changed nothing that mattered. Fleet continued to fill and empty at its own pace. Men entered owing coin and left owing their last breath. The gallows continued its work beyond the walls, the city continuing to offer what it could spare. What had been revealed could not be unseen, yet it could not be undone. The prison had already incorporated the truth into itself, sealed it behind stone and warmth. In the end, the accident served only to confirm what the walls had been saying all along. Fleet did not merely contain human suffering. It consumed it, refined it, and bound it into a form that would endure long after names and crimes were forgotten. The keeper had chosen the cheapest source available, not out of cruelty, but out of efficiency. The prison had accepted the offering without judgment, and in doing so, it had ensured that no part of those who passed through it would ever truly leave. Centuries passed, carrying the prison out of memory and into paperwork. Fleet closed quietly, its gates sealed not by ceremony but by disuse, its function absorbed into newer systems that promised efficiency without spectacle. Its name softened into history, mentioned in ledgers and footnotes, stripped of the weight it once carried. The river shifted. Streets were rerouted. The city layered itself over the old site with the confidence of something that believed time erased what it covered. Redevelopment came not as destruction but as correction. Surveyors marked the ground. Planners measured and remeasured, puzzled by irregularities that resisted neat division. When foundations were cut into the earth where Fleet had stood, workers noticed it immediately. Warmth rose from below, subtle at first, then unmistakable. In the early hours, when the air bit hard and breath fogged white, the ground steamed faintly as it was opened. Shovels struck stone that felt wrong beneath the hand, too smooth, too warm, vibrating faintly as if pressure were being redistributed rather than relieved. Tools dulled quickly, blades skidded. Drills complained with a low, protesting whine that traveled up the arms and settled into the teeth. Men laughed it off at first, blaming old masonry and bad luck, but the sensation persisted. The deeper they cut, the steadier the warmth became. It did not dissipate with exposure. It held. Some claimed it rose in slow pulses, more felt than seen, a gentle expansion and release that had nothing to do with weather or machinery. Engineers adjusted plans. Concrete was poured thicker than intended, reinforcing what lay beneath rather than replacing it. The old stone refused removal. Attempts to break it free risked collapse beyond the worksite, pressure shifting in ways calculations could not predict. It was easier to build atop it, to incorporate the foundation rather than challenge it. So the new buildings rose, their basements anchored to something older and denser than any modern material. They endured. Years passed, then decades. Surrounding structures cracked and sagged, victims of settling earth and changing water tables. Those built atop the old Fleet stone did not. Basements remained inexplicably dry despite heavy rains and rising river levels. Walls held steady through winters that split brick and buckled steel elsewhere. Repairs were infrequent. Maintenance costs dropped quietly. Property managers took pride in their buildings' resilience without knowing what sustained it. In winter, the difference became visible. Snow settled unevenly across rooftops and pavements, melting first along the walls of those structures rooted in the old site. Frost retreated from their edges as if repelled. Residents noticed warmer floors, rooms that held heat longer without explanation. Heating bills ran lower. Drafts were rare. The comfort was subtle but persistent, a steady assurance that lingered even in the coldest months. People moved in and settled. Families grew accustomed to the quiet solidity of their homes. Sleep came easily there, deeper and heavier than elsewhere. Some spoke of dreams that felt compressed, enclosed, but not unpleasant. Children pressed their palms to walls and laughed at the warmth, treating it as a harmless oddity. Pets favored corners where the heat pooled, curling close to stone that radiated comfort without source. No one spoke of the prison. Its history was buried beneath renovation permits and zoning changes, its records scattered across archives few bothered to consult. The keeper's name appeared nowhere that mattered. The men who had waited and died within those walls were reduced to numbers long ago erased or misfiled. The city had done what cities always do. It forgot. Yet beneath plaster and brick, beneath insulation and modern finish, the old stone remained. It held what it had been fed, compacted and bound beyond separation. The warmth that rose through newer foundations was not generated. It was retained, energy stored and redistributed with patient efficiency. The walls breathed still, though their breath now passed through layers of concrete and drywall, softened and civilized, mistaken for comfort. Occasionally, something surfaced. A contractor complained of tools vibrating without cause. A resident mentioned walls that felt alive late at night, warm in a way that suggested attention rather than insulation. Such remarks were dismissed easily. Old buildings were strange. Cities were full of quirks. There was no language left to describe what had been done here, and without language, there could be no accusation. Time continued its work. Generations replaced one another. The buildings outlasted renovations, ownership changes, and economic cycles. They aged well, retaining their structure and warmth long after neighboring properties required extensive repair. They were praised quietly, recommended without explanation. Something about them felt reliable. The prison had learned well. It had learned how to take what was given and make it permanent. It had learned patience, restraint, and balance. When feeding was abundant, it stored. When it was scarce, it conserved. It no longer needed active intervention. What had been incorporated was sufficient. At night, when the city settled and traffic noise receded into distant hum, the buildings rested. The warmth equalized. Pressure distributed itself through stone and earth. The slow, subtle rhythm continued, unnoticed by those sleeping above. It was not loud. It did not demand attention. It simply persisted. The prisoners were long gone. Their names dissolved into dust and paperwork. The keeper was forgotten, his intention erased by time and convenience. Yet the result remained, undeniable in its endurance. The prison had not survived despite them. It had survived because of them. What had once been a place of waiting had become a foundation. What had once consumed lives now sustained comfort. The city benefited without knowing the cost, warmed by a structure that remembered every debt it had been paid. Beneath modern London, in stone that no longer bore bars or chains, Fleet continued its quiet work. It did not protect the living. It did not mourn the dead. It simply held, exactly as it had been taught, breathing steadily in the dark, intact and satisfied, enduring exactly as intended.